So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the importance of the circulatory system. So this is the third system this year that we've spoken about. And so as always, we want to talk about, well, what is the significance of this system? What is its primary function along with its structure? So let's think about that. If you had to, explain to somebody what your idea was about the function of the circulatory system, I want you to think about what it is that would come to mind. What are the functions? And I'm hoping you can come up with a couple. And if you need to pause the video to think about that, then go right ahead. Typically, people will think about the fact that our circulatory system has the function of carrying nutrients, glucose, for instance, and oxygen to our cells. That usually comes to mind. And also that they carry waste away from cells. And what would one of those wastes be? Usually carbon dioxide, but there are others as well. Some other important functions of the circulatory system are that they carry chemical signals from one body part to another. So, for instance, hormones would be a good example of that. Um, and also, they distribute heat throughout the body, right? So, in the process of cellular respiration, there's a little bit of heat that's given off, just like in most chemical transformations. Heat is given off as a byproduct. Usually, it's thought of as waste, but in a way, it is useful at keeping our body temperature at a reasonable level. And so, our circulatory system helps to maintain that heat throughout our body. And lastly, is that our circulatory system is a part of our excretory system, which helps us to control fluid levels, right? So, for instance, blood pressure. And that's a concept that we explore in greater detail in the grade 12 course. So there you have it, some basic functions of the circulatory system. Obviously, we go in more depth, but this level, that's a great overview of its primary functions. Okay, so now we need to remember that in this course, we're not strictly looking at human anatomy, we're contemplating various members of the five kingdoms. So I want you to think here about do you remember this organism from the very beginning of our course? I'm hoping you do. It's an amoeba. And like many unicellular organisms, it's not going to have a circulatory system, but it will still need to accomplish the same kind of tasks as other organisms that are more complex. So unicellular organisms are not going to need a circulatory system. And so why is that? Well, often they're living in some sort of an aquatic environment, and that facilitates the diffusion of materials. Any materials that they would need can simply diffuse through that the surface of their cell, that cell membrane, and any waste can be expelled via the same sort of mechanism, right? So oxygen can diffuse directly from the external environment, and waste can diffuse directly out, right? So, just basically by virtue of the fact that it is so small, and it's able to efficiently get enough materials in that it needs to survive and grow and reproduce, and enough materials out so that it doesn't so that it can get rid of any wastes. Okay, so let's think about some more complex organisms, right? So we've looked at, unicellular organisms don't need a circulatory system, too simple. But there are also some simple aquatic multicellular organisms, and a sponge is a great example of that. They're not going to have a circulatory system. And the reason that they're not going to need it is that every single cell that would possibly need materials to enter and exit is in direct contact with water. So here is just a really good diagram of a sponge. You're not, let me repeat, not responsible for the information herein. It's just to create a nice visual, right? But so here's our sponge. It's an underwater aquatic invertebrate. Very, very simple. And so every single part of this organism is going to have sufficient contact with water. And if it has sufficient contact with water, diffusion of oxygen and nutrients in is going to happen efficiently enough for this organism to be able to survive, thrive, and reproduce. And that's really what we want, right? So, this used to be a GIF. I don't really know why it's not working today. That's a little disappointing. But really, it's just to show you that materials can flow in and out of it, have contact with any cell that would require oxygen and nutrients, and by the same token, also get rid of wastes. Okay, so now we are brought to more complex organisms, and I've used the example of a human here, but of course, we can also extend that to other members of the animal kingdom and plant kingdom for that matter. But here specifically, this unit's on animals. So complex multicellular organisms like humans require a circulatory system. You might be thinking, well, why? I mean, I know that we need one, but why? Why is it that we can't exist like our sponge and simply, get what we need from the external environment through basic diffusion? And I'm hoping what comes to mind is that we have not all of the cells in our body are going to be in direct contact with the external environment. So I'm thinking about, like, for instance, our liver, right? So our liver, that liver is not in contact with the external environment. One might say, well, okay, the mouth is and the stomach is just by virtue of that alimentary canal, but our internal organs are not in direct contact. So that necessitates us having a more complex circulatory system. So I also want to mention too that there are two basic types within the animal kingdom that we discuss, or we're going to discuss in terms of circulatory system. And the first is an open circulatory system, and the second is a closed circulatory system, right? So I want you to take a minute to think about, well, what might differentiate an open circulatory system from a closed one? And also, which type of circulatory system do humans have? In other words, what am I depicting here in this diagram? Okay, so we'll take a look at this diagram that juxtaposes the open system with the closed system. And you might be able to come up with some more pieces of information to help support your understanding or clarify it. I'm going to describe to you some things that I notice. First of all, in a closed system, I think of it almost like an electrical circuit of sorts, which is that it is a loop that is closed off. There's nothing kind of stopping any materials from flowing in the closed system from leaking out of said system. There's typically a pump in both systems, but one of the differences is that the open system seems to have these little holes in it called ostia. Okay, this is an ostium. But some similarities, they both seem to have some kind of a artery or blood vessel. But the open system is not a closed loop. There's sort of this gap here, right? So what's really going on here? Well, let me explain. So humans have a closed system, and I think knowing that will help you understand the difference between these two circulatory modes. So our heart is essentially our pump. And when our heart pumps, we pump blood to the rest of our body, to some other blood vessels, and then eventually back to our pump, our heart. When we're looking at an open circulatory system, basically the pump does what our heart does, which is to pump fluids into the body, but it doesn't stay within those. It kind of goes into the open body cavity. So you might say, well, how, if the blood or fluid is getting pumped into this body cavity, how does it ever get back efficiently to the pump? Well, that's where the ostia come in, because those are little holes. So basically, you have when you have this pump, this heart, if you will, pump fluids out, that creates a bit of an empty space in that pump. It's a vacuum of sorts, so that when the fluid moves into the body cavity, that vacuum that exists in the pump is able to draw the fluids back into itself. And then so really that's essentially what's happening. So if you look closely, the arrows here in an open system, the arrows both point away from the pump, because any materials that are going to flow from the body cavity go back in through the ostia. Whereas if you look at the arrows closely in the closed system, the pump is it's going in a circular fashion. So out and then back in, but never does that fluid leave any of these vessels. Okay, so now this is a grasshopper. Again, this was meant to be, an animated GIF, but something happened here. So in terms of the circulatory system of this is like some kind of an insect, maybe perhaps a grasshopper. It has this, what we call a tubular heart, or sometimes it's referred to as aortic arches. And so basically this, you can see here's an ostium, here's another ostium, and there are multiple ostia all along this tubular heart, which pumps the blood-like fluid, I'm going to talk about that in a second, out into the body cavity, sort of just bathing the organs, if you will. And then that, pressure difference in that tubular heart, the ostia are able to, when they sort of expand, draw in any of that blood-like fluid back into that pump. And that's essentially what happens. So what types of organisms do we see these open circulatory systems? We see insects, snails, and crustaceans having these open circulatory systems. Earthworms, squids, vertebrates are going to have what we call a closed circulatory system. And so, people might think, oh, well, earthworms, I thought it'd be the more complex organisms would have open, closed systems and simple organisms having open. Well, not necessarily. A worm's not too complicated, right? So here we see the heart again, or these like aortic arches, but notice at no point do we see any opportunity for fluids within these blood vessels to exit and bathe the organs, right? They're all contained in vessels as a closed system. So there you have it. Now I want to now just kind of juxtapose or contrast the features of an open circulatory system with that of a closed circulatory system. And I want to see if you can come up with some of this as we go along, or anticipate. So we would say that in an open circulatory system, blood is pumped just directly into the body cavities, bathing all of the cells in blood. That's essentially what's happening there. So how is a closed circulatory system different? Well, in a closed circulatory system, the blood is all going to be contained within specific vessels, be it arteries, veins, venules, arterioles, or just capillaries, right? In an open circulatory system, organisms are going to have a blood-like fluid that's actually just not really just blood on its own, but it's a combination of blood and all this interstitial fluid, or fluid that exists between cells. And then we call that hemolymph. And the lymph is like your lymph nodes, lymph fluid. So hemo for the blood part, right? Because there's the hemoglobin. So what do we have? Well, we have our blood that is in the vessels, and that's going to be separated from any interstitial fluid. So there we go. That's the fluid between the cells. Next, the contraction of the heart is going to push blood from one cavity to another. So you'll remember I talked about the ostia and how when the heart contracts or squeezes together, then the hemolymph is going to leak into the body cavities. But as soon as that pump expands again, it creates a bit of a vacuum. It's going to suck in any hemolymph that's kind of in that body cavity. So that's how we're circulating that. That's how we're circulating that hemolymph. Whereas in a closed circulatory system, that contraction of the heart is going to move blood from large vessels into smaller vessels. The pressure, because of the high pressure, we would have to have the heart connected to large vessels first. Otherwise, there'd be too much pressure and the vessels would burst. But then we bring it from large vessels into smaller and increasingly smaller ones to the various tissues that are going to require the oxygen and perhaps nutrients that are being transported within that blood. So that is pretty much it. I'm going to go back here because I'm giving you a sneak peek of the next lesson, which is components of blood. But if you have any questions, of course, feel free to contact me via email or just go into our Zoom meeting and I'll be happy to help you out.